Welcome back to our series, Work Bestie Business, where we discuss things that happen in our working lives and maybe we get through it a little bit easier together having these conversations. Last week, we talked about burnout and how that looks, how we define it, what it even means, how we combat it, my experiences with it. So if you haven't checked out that video, go check it out. It's a good one. Today, we're gonna get into a little bit more specific to a type of burnout. So I like to call it BOREOUT, but it's the underchallenged burnout, really at its core what it is. We're gonna talk about how that looks, how that can present itself, what you can do, what I've done in the past with it, because I think a lot of us experience it. There's been so many different things over the years that have contributed to requiring higher levels of stimulation versus back in the day where there just wasn't as much stimulus in your life in general, and now we kind of like crave it. Like I said before, that closely resembles BOREOUT is really that under-challenged burnout, so that one of 4 types of burnout that we see, and burnout specifically being tied to a workplace phenomenon. So it's actually, burnout is workplace specific, work specific, as is BOREOUT, or how we're using it in the context today is workplace specific. And this type of burnout, BOREOUT, it involves a lack of challenge, a lack of stimulation. And I'm sure many of us have experienced this in our jobs before, especially when we've been at the job in the same role for an extended period of time, doing a lot of repeat things, stuff that just maybe was interesting at the beginning, not so much now. It can also be tied to the lack of meaning within your work, the lack of passion, the lack of thinking that your work actually makes a difference whatsoever. And for some people that might not be important, but for others that might contribute to BOREOUT in general as well. You start to lose a lot of the motivation. You know, starting tasks can become more difficult. You're so bored, but you're also struggling to do things at the same time. And it can be quite impactful to the work and your work days as well, because maybe you're just not getting as much done. You're having a really hard time starting tasks. It impacts you mentally as well and your mental health, and just, we don't have to love what we do and our job doesn't have to be a huge source of enjoyment. But if you're spending 8 hours a day doing something that just bores you to death, it's just like mind-numbing, almost painful, that's a lot of your day to dedicate to something with such a negative feeling associated to it. Thanks for being here, as always. I like having these conversations. I feel like it opens up the door to talk about a lot of things that maybe people are experiencing and don't know, how to necessarily identify it, or maybe you're feeling really alone in experiencing this, and perhaps just watching this video might make you feel like you're not alone in that and other people go through it too, because I know I've gone through it many times in my career. BOREOUT, the term itself, notably came from around 2007, 2008, when it was used as a title of a book, I believe, is like where the big boom of the word BOREOUT came. It's by Rothland and Werder. I don't even know if I'm pronouncing that right, but it was called BOREOUT, Overcoming Workplace Demotivation. I haven't read it myself. I'm not a huge reader. I'm recently trying to read a little bit more and having like 15, 20 minutes dedicated before bedtime to try to read, which is a whole other topic on why I don't really like to read, but we're trying. Anyway, so that's kind of where the term BOREOUT really took off. And I like it because it well encompasses kind of the feeling that I was experiencing a lot when it came to work. So BOREOUT differs from other types of burnout in the fact that it is caused by understimulation. That is the root source of it. Some characteristics or symptoms that you might experience or might be facing in your life that could be a result of this BOREOUT would be loss of motivation, reduced productivity, exhaustion, increased stress, depression, inability to focus, apathy, weakened immunity, wow, this list goes on, disrupted sleeping habits, listlessness. Is that a listlessness? Listlessness? I have my little notes out here and I was like, listlessness. So it's, say that again.
Feeling of having no energy.
Okay, the feeling of having no energy. And enthusiasm. And unwilling to do anything that revolves around effort. Giving any effort. Listlessness, I just learned that word. Disinterest, feelings of sadness, anxiety, hopelessness. I can relate to that absolutely when it comes to work at times in different parts of my career. I absolutely have experienced that, and maybe you have too, but that's a list of things that you could be experiencing as a result of BOREOUT. If you're trying to identify, is this a different kind of burnout? Is this specifically BOREOUT? That might help you narrow it down a little bit. So some signs of BOREOUT, in addition to those, it might take a lot more effort or feel like it takes so much more effort to complete a task, a relatively easy task, something that in the past didn't feel this difficult. I know that that's been a big one for me, where it's like you have this task, you know how to do it. Starting it is like running a marathon. You're just like, I am exhausted thinking about that. So that could, that could be a sign as well, something that maybe you're facing. As we're experiencing these and these things are starting to feel a lot more challenging, we often develop these coping mechanisms to deal with this new feeling of exhaustion or just amount of effort exerted for output. And that might look like severe procrastinations. You might make yourself look like you are already really busy to give the illusion to others that you're really, really busy, to avoid taking on additional work because the workload that you have, maybe it started this big and now it just feels this big. There's a lot of coping mechanisms that can come as a result of these feelings. So maybe you're like, oh, I'm a procrastinator. And then it's like, okay, get one step deeper. Maybe you're procrastinating because of BOREOUT, right? So we want to get to the root of the problems as we're facing these issues so that we can address the root, so that all the different coping mechanisms, they go away with it, right? And sometimes you might not have identified that it's BOREOUT, but maybe you find yourself asking more for different work, more meaningful work. Maybe you're always wanting to get involved in different projects, and we can be really proactive sometimes in being like, I want to do that, without necessarily identifying that, like, I'm really bored, I'm experiencing this type of burnout. And so maybe constantly searching for something different might be a sign of that, which is absolutely true for my experience in the past, because I have been more proactive when I've been really bored at work, or at least I've constantly tried to find other things and look into other things. And I would spend so much of my time, instead of doing the task that like I really need to get done, I would spend so much of my time being like, what else can I do that might interest me in the slightest, because that work seems so much easier. And then asking potentially your manager or whatnot to get involved in different things and just wanting to switch things up. So detachment is also a big one with it, is when you kind of lose the meaning or the connection or interest in the job you're doing in the company, and you just kind of detach from coworkers, you detach from the work itself. I'm not saying by any means that you need to feel so invested in your work and it should feel so personal to you and you're so deeply attached to all of these things. But I also don't think you should be completely detached from it altogether as well. Like, I think there's a kind of a fine balance. And if you're really, really far one way or the other, I think that might signify that there's something else going on in the root there. And so when you feel so disconnected and so detached from what you're doing, that potentially could be a sign that maybe you're experiencing BOREOUT. So work avoidance kind of ties back into this needing to look busier than you actually are, or prove that you're busier than you actually are, which is a really interesting one, because I think oftentimes we do see that a lot, where maybe you're on your lunch break and you're not actually doing anything, but you want people around you to think you're so busy. And so maybe you're like taking calls or whatnot, or maybe after work when you're with friends and you just kind of pick up and be like, oh, I'm so busy at work, I'm just gonna like make this call. It's this like overcompensation to feel like you're busy when you're actually so bored, which when I was looking up different manifestations or coping mechanisms for, I found that one so interesting, because you wouldn't necessarily think that, right? Because you're like, oh, well, I think that they're just so attached to this job that they just like can't let it go. But it was actually saying the opposite. Someone's trying to feel busy and validated for that gap of how much they don't feel like they're doing, or that kind of missing piece of it. And then another sign potentially of BOREOUT, it comes back to this work avoidance, kind of, we touched on this a little bit earlier. It's this coping strategy that you try to make yourself or convince people around you that you're so busy so that you're not taking on more work. I feel like that's a really interesting one, because I wouldn't necessarily think that when I think about BOREOUT and how it could present. I genuinely would just be like, oh, that person's just like so busy. They must love what they do, or must be really, really attached to it. But it can also be the opposite, where they are experiencing this BOREOUT and they're just trying to convince maybe not even everyone around them, but themselves, that they're busier than they are for whatever reason. I'm sure there's like a whole psych piece of that we could deep dive into with an expert in this subject, which I'm absolutely not. This is just like the research that I've done and kind of my experiences with things. What causes BOREOUT? Right? Like, let's get a little bit more into that. First of all, it can happen to everyone. So if you're like, that'll never happen to me, I never get bored. Okay, well, great, congratulations. No, I'm just kidding. But it can happen to anyone at any point in time. Like I said in the burnout video, it's a type of burnout, and burnout doesn't mean that you're weak. It doesn't mean that you failed. It doesn't mean that you can't survive the environment you're in. Like, no, we all experience burnout to some extent. I strongly believe that throughout our working lives. It's the reality of it, and how we kind of cope with it is the important part, or how we get through it is the important part. The fact that it happens to us, I don't really think means much of anything. It's just part of being human. And so bore-out, anyone can experience that. Let's just start there. But work that isn't challenging or skill testing enough. Maybe you start at the job and everything is really interesting and you're really putting your skills into action. And over time, when you've done it so many times and you're not really growing or expanding on your skills, and it just becomes redundant, really mundane, that can lead to bore-out. Lack of workload. If you are someone who works under a manager that hasn't really given you a lot to do, maybe they gave you a ton to do and you kind of worked through it, and maybe there's a bit of a disconnect, you just don't have a lot on your plate, so you're trying to fill gaps with things and you're bored. You just don't have enough on your plate, and maybe you haven't communicated that to your manager. There's probably a whole other discussion that needs to happen there as well, but that could be potentially a cause of it too, is you don't have enough work, right? The work might be fun, but you just don't have enough of it. Lulls in business activities can also contribute to this too. Like maybe your manager doesn't have more work to give you because potentially the job you're in is like really, really crazy high stress and then nothing, and then really, really crazy high stress and nothing, and maybe this bore-out pattern is just something tied to the cyclical nature of the business that you're in, and that might be important for you to identify as well. There's also high work proficiency, so maybe you're someone who gets given a task and the task has, let's say, 3 weeks to complete it, and you finish it in the first 2 days, and then you're sitting there. And you're like, I'm bored. And you spend the next 2.5 weeks not having anything to do. So you could just be so proficient at the work that you're doing it so quickly, and then you sit on your thumbs, right? So there's a lot that can kind of add into that narrative of not having enough work to do. That's really, if you're experiencing that, that's for you to figure out where that comes from or why that's happening. But just in general, if you just don't have enough work to do, which I feel like that makes sense. That tracks, right? The next one would be work that doesn't feel meaningful. You're doing something and you're like, this has no meaning. So maybe it's not meaningful to the business. You just don't really see how it impacts the business, or you don't feel like you're really contributing anything. It's kind of like work that you're like, if I stop doing this tomorrow, like, would anything change? Would anyone care? Would anyone notice? Maybe it just, the work you're doing doesn't align with your interests, your passion. Maybe it's really misaligned with your belief system, and the work that you're doing goes against something that you believe in, potentially, because we don't all have the luxury of working a job in an industry that we love and believe in and really lines up with our belief system. Like, that's just not a reality for a lot of people. So maybe that might be an inner conflict that you're having of, you're doing this work, but it's not contributing to the way that you see the world and you believe the world should work. So I was reading, funny enough, I was actually reading the other night, and in my short 20 minutes of reading, I was in this book written by Jay Shetty, the Think Like a Monk, I believe the title is. Anyways, and there was this passage I was going through, and it was talking about the quadrants of potential, which I thought was really interesting and really applicable to this conversation, because you have your 4 quadrants. And in quadrant 1, it's where you have skill but no passion towards, let's say, the work that you're doing. Let's put this like into a work context. The second quadrant would be you have skill and passion. Like, that's ideally where we all want to be, where we're doing work that we're skilled at and we're so passionate about. Like, that's the dream, right? The third quadrant is you have no skill and no passion. So you're doing something that you are not good at and you have no interest in it whatsoever, no passion towards it. That is where we want to avoid. What is going to lead to so many issues over time, and BOREOUT absolutely being one of them. And then we've got quadrant 4, the no skill but passion. You're like, I suck at this, but heck, I'm passionate about it. And that's an okay place to be as well. So you've got your quadrant 1 and your quadrant 4, which you have half the piece of the puzzle, right? You have, in 1, you have skill, not really any passion. Quadrant 4, you got all the passion, 0 skill. And then in 2 is where we ideally want to be. It's this skill and passion kind of marry up. And I think it's interesting bringing this into the context and the conversation of bore-out. For me in the past, when I've struggled a lot with being really bored in a job. And for me, the root of it was I had enough work on my plate, but the work I was doing, I had no passion about. It was really mundane. It was more the admin stuff. I'm someone who requires like a higher level of stimulation to keep interested in things. And it was just, for me, the most unstimulating work in the world. It was very step by step and process and procedure, which some people are amazing at and they thrive at. I suck at following instructions. I suck at following rules. I'm more of like the creative. Like, let me just do something super creative, and that just keeps me stimulated and my brain can go in all different directions, and like, that's where I thrive. And then the work I was doing too, I was like, okay, I'm passionate about maybe parts of it. The passion is just sucked dry when I'm doing the super mundane things. And so where I was struggling with of so much of my job was in that I was skilled, or no, I was unskilled and like very dwindling passion towards the actual product. But then there was pieces of my job that I was skilled at and I had a little bit more passion for. And so for me, it was this idea of, I have all of this work under my umbrella, if you will. Maybe I can shift a little bit towards more of that higher skill, higher passion, because really, if I'm more skilled at it, and it was a gap that we were having in the company, if I have this skill, I could potentially save them money, which matters because they'll be more likely to let me do it. And two, it's something that I want to do, so it's going to make my work life a little bit easier. So I remember there was this time where there was a lot of design work, UX, UI work that was being done and was contracted out to a third party. And I was doing a lot of like the back end stuff for it. So like the boring, more like integration and working with, developers, but doing more of like the admin side of things and not so much like the creative side of things. But I was so interested in the creative side of things, and I am a very creative person. I have that skill set. I started to just do similar work to what a third party was doing. No, I was straight up like doing very similar work, I'm not gonna lie, to what they were doing, because I found it so interesting and I thought I was so good at it. And I also had this skill set or knowledge of the business that I'm like, I can do this in a way that fills the gap they have, whereas they don't have necessarily as much business information or expertise as I do. And when you marry up that expertise with the creativity, like I think I could do something really cool here, and it's also gonna re-spark my passion for work. And so I actually made an entire slide deck, kind of this is what it could look like, conversation starter deck, if you will, and presented it to my internal team. And I was like, look, listen, I think they're offering great value of the things that I couldn't really do, that I couldn't do yet because I ended up learning them. Here's kind of what I'm coming forward with of this is applicable to the workplace. Anyways, I had this whole business case presentation, if you will, and I ended up transitioning within a couple months full time to doing that piece of the puzzle while still maintaining a few other of my old stuff that I didn't really love as much, and then offloaded that to someone who it was way more aligned with their skill set. It shifted my entire work landscape for a little while because I was so interested in it. So I re-sparked that passion while also being able to marry it up with my skill. And so I talk about the quadrants of potential because I think it's really important to kind of see where you sit right now and where your gaps are. So kind of seeing, okay, am I skilled at this? Am I passionate about it? What quadrant? Where can I shift things so that potentially in the organization there is an opportunity for me to do things that I'm a little bit more passionate about? Or maybe there is an opportunity to do things I'm a little bit more skilled at. Can I just move a little bit in that direction? Because it's going to impact your work life and how you experience that so much more, and potentially combat some of that bore out. I'm also someone that I get bored when I do things for too long. After a while of doing that, I'm bored, like a little bit bored. When I am repeating a skill, no matter how much I was interested in at the beginning, over time, if that skill's not developing, the stimulation for me just drops. And so I was experiencing a little bit more of bore out, and I was like, okay, I've seen this movie before, I know where she goes. And so I'm like, how can I bring a little bit more passion? Because I was still skilled in it. I was keeping the skill within my job for sure. And I was like, okay, I need to re-spark my passion here. I was like, all right, what else can I do within my workday I feel passionately about? And it ended up, I was doing something completely not in my job description that ended up just becoming part of my job, which was great. I ended up transitioning this whole part of the office into this mindfulness meditation space where people could essentially go and I would lead. And a lot of people don't know this, but I'm actually a certified yoga teacher. And so I would teach these like movement classes and yoga classes and meditation classes over lunch. And there was no pressure for anyone to join because it was their personal time and that's for them to choose. But it was kind of an offering. If you're around and if you're also interested in doing this, I'll be here and leading it. And we ended up getting this awesome group together. Anyways, I'm not gonna go too far into detail, but that re-sparked my passion at the job because it was something I was really passionate about. I was totally fine to do that on my personal time because that's how I would spend my lunches anyways. When I was working in the office full time was trying to get my body moving, doing a little bit more moving and meditation, not so much like an hour focused on lunch. That's what I was doing anyway. So then when people joined, like that wasn't work for me. That was just, I don't know. But then I ended up being absorbed into my work responsibilities to a point where we were bringing in like therapy dogs or therapy goats one time and just trying to like bring a smile to people's days. We brought in massage therapists. People could take a little bit of break throughout the day. Anyways, I say that because that re-sparked a passion in my job that had nothing to do with my job. The opportunity was there for me within the company I was working at the time to do that. Adding that bit more to my plate made my overall work experience more enjoyable. And I'm not saying you have to go up, start like a wellness group or do it. Like there might be something that you can do within your organization that just might bring a little bit more passion to it. right? And I say that because we're talking the context of BOREOUT. You might be like, yeah, I'm not passionate about my job, I'm fine, but I'm like happy and I feel good, and that's amazing. Like, you don't have to be passionate about your job. I don't want you to get that as a takeaway from here, but for me, I noticed that the lack of passion or interest was impacting my burnout, my BOREOUT specifically. And so I was trying to find ways to combat that so that I would have a more enjoyable working experience, essentially. And then also impacting others through that process, through the service that I was offering. So that's why I talk about that quadrant of potential. So kind of take a peek at that. Maybe I'm sure there's more information online about those that go into more detail, but it's just kind of important to know where you stand potentially. It might help identify your gaps at work. Now we're going to get into some more general burnout prevention or dealing with burnout tips and tricks and things you might want to integrate, things that might not resonate with you all, and just chuck them out the window, and that's fine too. One way that we can potentially prevent BOREOUT or decrease the chances of it would be proactive hiring. In the interview process, when you're coming into a job, it's really important for you to be transparent with the company, but really for the company to be transparent with you about what they stand for, how they operate, what the culture is like, any information that you could get out of them aside from the job itself, the skill piece of it, to understand, is this a place that you see yourself thriving? Is this an environment that you want to work in? Can you see yourself in this environment successfully long term? Because if you're in the interview process and they're saying things that you're like, I know that those contribute to negative things within myself or lead me to places like BOREOUT or burnout, then you can identify it earlier on that, yeah, this might not be the best fit for you. So I think that employers need to be really, really forthcoming and transparent with what their working environment's really like so that you're able to identify if that's a right environment for you. Because at the end of the day, the company wants to bring in people that mesh with that environment because there'll be less turnover over time and they'll just be happier and so many other reasons. So it's actually beneficial for both parties, but it kind of starts early on of being like, listen, here's the deal of what it's really like here. Is this going to work for you? And you can see if that's a good match. 2, it's asking for help. So that's more on, the employee side once you're working. If you are not interested in the work that you're doing anymore, you're finding it's becoming harder to do, even though you've done it a million times, you're losing a lot of that motivation, that interest. Asking for help, having conversations with your manager, making it known to them of where you want to go or what skills you want to develop, potentially what things you want to get exposed to, just putting it on their radar so that when opportunities arise, they're able to go, oh yes, Laura mentioned that before, I'm going to put her forth for this opportunity. Just starting to keep in close contact with, I'm really interested in doing this, or you're involved in this project and I'd love to get involved too, I'm really interested in learning more about this, or is there, different work that I could be doing, or just having those open discussions and dialogue. A lot can be done when we have good communication, especially with our managers. I know not everyone has a manager who is open to that or who is as supportive as maybe as we'd like them to be. So I know that might not be the case for everyone, but if you're in a case where you have a manager who's supportive and listening, it's okay to voice the things that you're interested in learning more about or wanting to be exposed to, or the things that you're more passionate about, or the skills you have that maybe they don't even know you have that you're just not really using in your current role. More on the employer side, it's providing challenges and opportunities more for growth and skill transfers and skill exposure. I worked at a company who, I think it was towards the end actually of when I was working there, but they started to offer what did different departments do. Because it was a large organization, it was oftentimes you didn't even realize what else was available within that organization in terms of roles and responsibilities and exposure to different systems or teams or projects and whatnot. And so it was in an effort to kind of say, this is what the company's actually doing behind the scenes and the things that we're involved in, whether that's talking about AI and its applicability within finance systems, or the back end of IT of how they're integrating AI with their new e-commerce platforms, or how the marketing team's using this new software to do all these different things. And I know that's so tech-based and that's more of my background, but there's so many different things that we can be exposed to that we might not be aware of. And so on the employer side, I think it's important to highlight the different areas within your business that are being done, so that maybe if an employee is really not happy in the role they're currently in, they might not have to leave to get what they're searching for. They might just be able to transfer internally to get exposure to something else, right? So I think that could be a good one. Encouraging innovation. Obviously, we're talking a lot about stimulation here, especially with BOREOUT. When we're talking about innovation and new exciting things, we want to have these collaborative opportunities, encourage innovation in general. So kind of keeping up with what's new, what's exciting, bringing new ideas to the table, re-sparking that interest for people to learn, for people to get stimulated again in a lot of different things, to use your brain. So it's not always the same boring routine things, and creating an environment where people feel safe to come forward with new ideas and new ways of thinking or doing things or projects and suggestions and all of that. I think that that can kind of help as well. And then just teamwork. And I don't talk about just teamwork and like put people together and make them work in a team. Like I'm talking about true teamwork where people are all contributing, people all feel safe to contribute, putting people together that maybe don't have the same kind of skill sets. Because I know for me, I love working with people that I'm nothing like. They have the skills that I don't, or the passions that I just don't. And so when you make teams out of people with very differing skills, very differing passions, you almost fill in the gaps of each other, because while I might not be really skilled in one area and not really passionate about either, that might be someone else really passionate, really skilled. And so when you're making these really diverse teams, I find it really helpful for things like BOREOUT, because the things that you're really not interested in are probably going to be taken up by someone else within that team, and the things they're not interested or passionate about, or the skills that they lack, you might have and you can kind of take on. So being really intentional, I guess, with the teamwork that you are assigning and the groups of people that you are putting together. Positive impact opportunities, creating opportunities where people feel like their work matters, where they're able to bring forth their skills to make a notable difference. I think BOREOUT, oftentimes when we feel like our work is just like meaningless, and it's like, if I didn't even do this, would anyone notice? Like it really feeds into that like procrastination, put it off, makes it feel even harder to get started, because you're like, even if I do this, which I don't want to do, it's not even going to matter. So having more positive impact opportunities, more opportunities where people can do meaningful work and recognize the work and feel like their work actually matters towards the overall goals and objectives of the company. Talking to different career coaches or mentors is important, especially if it's in an area that you don't really understand. I think when we're listening to people who speak about their experience in something that it's so new to us and so different from what we've experienced, can almost re-spark a stimulation because it's different. It can also go the other way though, if you'd be like, yeah, I'm not interested at all, I can't relate to this whatsoever. So I guess that one could go either ways now that I'm thinking out loud about it. Finding a mentor or having conversations with someone who inspires you. Many of us potentially have worked with someone or in an environment with someone where we're like, I really admire something about you. I really admire the way that you work, the way that you think. I really admire your work-life harmony and integration, how you have such a well-rounded life from what I can see. I really admire how you speak in front of a room. I really admire, like there's so many different things. If you can identify something you admire from someone and then spend intentional time with them about that thing, I think that could be really important. And when companies can foster this mentorship idea, or you don't even need like a program to do it, to be honest. Like what I've done in the past is I just scheduled meetings with people I admire, truly, to go over different things, or just be like, hey, can I pick your brain on this? I'd love to know how you got to this position. Setting up more of those informal discussions that at the end of the day are work, because they contribute to making you more, whatever you want to call it, productive, efficient, skilled at work. If you admire someone, drop them an email. Be like, hey, I'd love to take 15, 20 minutes of your time and just ask you some questions about something. Or if you're really interested in getting into a different kind of profession or role, it's really important to understand not only what that role looks like to you now. When we have these ideas in our minds of like, that is my dream job. Like I would love to have that job. I would love to do it. That's what I want to do, because we have an external appreciation for the job itself of what we think it is. I always urge you to see if you can shadow someone in a non-creepy way. Like obviously they need to know that you're shadowing them. Have it done in a way where you see what goes on behind the scenes. I've seen jobs where I'm like, that looks like the dang best job ever. I want to have it. And then I get a little bit closer and I'm like, what do you mean you work until like 11 p.m. every night, then you sleep for 4 hours, and then you never see friends or family, and you don't have time to go to the gym? Like, I'm like, hold up, that's not what I want, like whatsoever. Shadow someone that does that position and see all that encompasses that position and what goes on behind the scenes, and then evaluate if that's something that aligns with what you want in your career, or you're like, yep, I'm actually good. You keep doing that and I'll admire from a distance, but I don't want to do the work that it takes to get to that job, or the work that it takes to maintain that job, or the lifestyle that comes along with that job. And while we're on the topic of potentially shifting, careers or roles, you're never too old to do that. And I hate so dearly that common misconception. It's like, well, I'm too old to switch that, all right? Yeah, I can't learn anything new because I'm already so far in my career, but you can change jobs whenever the heck you want. You know that, right? You're never starting from the bottom again. Like you're starting from where you are today with everything, all the skills and knowledge you've accumulated up to today. Maybe they're not in your mind directly related to the new career you want to go into, but there's a lot of soft skills that you've been building up for years that I guarantee you are directly applicable to wherever you're wanting to go next in your career. And I think the scariest part of changing careers is the commitment that you're going to change them. And once you've taken that first step of committing to it, it gets so much less scary. Coming from someone who changed her career drastically over the last couple years, it's terrifying when you take that initial step. But then after that, you're like, okay, that wasn't so bad. I'm allowed to make changes. And you're allowed to do that at any point in your career. And so if you're someone who's maybe so bored at what you've been doing and you're like, I can't change though, I'm too old, or I've been doing this too long, you're getting in your own way. That's not true. It's just the narrative you keep telling yourself, so you're making it true for you, but it's not actually true. You can pivot at any different time that you want to, and you're taking everything that you developed up until today along with you, so you're not starting at the very bottom again. I just want to remind you about that. There's also this beautiful idea that being bored isn't all bad. Like I think when we talk about boredom, it's like, oh, that's the worst thing that could happen. And in this context of burnout and bore-out, yes, it is negative. It is not a good thing. But when we're talking about being bored is not always a bad thing. And this has been a big learning point for me too, because I get bored so easily. Like I could do something twice and I'm like, bored of it. I'm so bored of it now. Bored can create space for creativity. Bored can create space for reflection. Bored can create space for self-discovery and exploration. And so if you're feeling really bored at work, maybe you are in that group of people who just doesn't have a lot of workload on their plate, or maybe you're in a lull right now within, the cycle of your projects. That's a great opportunity to get creative about things, maybe to pick up a new skill during your boredom, or maybe to just sit in boredom. The art of doing nothing. That is one thing I am trying to master at the moment, where some days it's going well and other days I don't want to talk about it. Sometimes we can associate being bored with just like, oh my God, nothing I do has meaning. What am I doing with my life? For some people, being bored would be a privilege. I need to remind myself of that, because I know there's points in my life where, oh my gosh, I'm not bored, and all I want to be in that moment is bored. I'm like, I cannot wait for the day I can just rot on my couch and have nothing on my plate. So I think when you're in boredom for so long, it feels so overwhelming, but being bored isn't always a bad place to be. And so it can offer a lot of opportunity as well. I just want to highlight that and bring it to the table. It's totally something I'm working on. Bored currently is my own living hell, but I'm working on it, right? I'm working on it. If I say it enough times, I'll believe it, right? Boredom looks different for everyone, and the amount of stimulation that we require, I did mention this at the beginning of the video, is just different. So while one person might not require a lot of stimulation to stay out of this space of being bored, someone else might require constant stimulation in order to not be bored. And so we can't necessarily look at this conversation from a blanket solution of like, okay, if I do this as an employer, I do this with my team as a manager, they'll all be fine, no one's going to be bored. Because you can do the exact same thing to multiple people. Some of them might be bored, some of them might not be bored. It's because we're all just inherently different, which is such a beautiful part of being human. A lot of times, for many people I know, when we do nothing, our brain starts to pick up and we start to reflect on things. Maybe we start to face things or think about things, or are forced to face things that we've just been pushing down, we just don't want to deal with. I think a lot of us can get trapped in that idea of we get so busy because we just like don't want to address something going on, and then when you're not busy anymore, you're like, the only thing left to do is address that thing. I think not. But I think it's a really beautiful place to be, of this art of doing nothing, because when we take the time to slow down, to let slow be slow and let easy be easy, we can start to observe the world in a very different way. Every time I take the intention of slowing down, it sounds like so bizarre, but when I go out for a walk, the smells are different, the colors are different. I take in so much more. Maybe I notice the flowers that the neighbors have planted, whereas when I'm in that really busy go mindset, I don't notice that. I don't take it all in because I haven't slowed down. And so the art of doing nothing is something that I'm trying to put a lot more intention behind in my life. Of being bored isn't always a bad thing if we don't allow it to bring us to a place of negative, and we use it as a place of space and creating opportunity to work on yourself, to get to know yourself, to look at the world around you in a different way. We all have different levels of stimulation and how much stimulation is required for us to feel a certain level of purpose and a certain level of productivity or what have you. And it's important to note that because what's going to work for me might not work for you, or what's required for me stimulation wise might not be required for someone else. Something I also personally feel like that helps a lot with BOREOUT is when I have something to look forward to. So when I have something that I know I'm going to be passionate about, or something that is really going to increase my stimulation moving forward, whether that's hanging out with a friend or going on a vacation or planting my new garden that I just got. When I have something to look forward to, it helps me with when I'm in that bore-out period. It basically sends a signal to me, or it reminds me that we feel this way right now. We have this thing coming up that gives you an opportunity to feel some way different. So if I can't pull myself out of that bore-out state, I have something ahead of me that will likely pull me, or just allow me to feel something different in that moment. And so I always try, when I'm really feeling stuck in that, to have something to look forward to as a way to support myself in getting through it. And the importance of having people around you that motivate you and inspire you. I think when we feel the sense of bore-out, we feel this, I often refer to it like this rotting. Like, don't get me wrong, I love to rot on the couch some nights, but there's like good rotting and then there's bad rotting. When I'm like rotting in a not good way and I'm just so bored and I'm having a hard time peeling myself off the floor to like do stuff, or when I'm having a really hard time getting started on a task and I'm surrounded by people who also are like that and also in that same pace, and they're not pulling themselves out, you almost feed off of one another. It's really important to have people in your life that can support you. It's so funny how it's so much easier to pull other people up and encourage them, but then when it comes to ourselves, we have a harder time like pulling ourselves up. I think it's important to surround yourself with people that can support you, can inspire you both personally and professionally, give you a little bit more of a spark, or give you a little bit more of a push maybe, or we all need different things, or maybe give you a little bit of inspiration of, I want to learn more about what you're learning about, or, oh, tell me more about your hobby. I might, be interested in that, or just someone to give you a little kick in the butt to say, listen, I know you don't want to do this thing, but you got to get it done. All right, so those are just some things I think are important to consider. I know I've rambled on so much. I hope something in this video maybe resonates with you. Maybe you learned something, maybe you didn't. Maybe you're just like here for the vibes, and I'm cool with that too. I appreciate you being part of this series. If you have experience with BOREOUT, if you have anything to add to the conversation, whether it's something that you've gone through, you've seen someone else go through, you have a tip or trick or something to add to the conversation, please, I'll meet you in the comment section below. I absolutely love that. Thank you for coming to our episode 2 of Work Bestie Business, where we discuss things that are just part of a lived human experience in the working world, and we're all just trying to navigate them together. It's our first time on this earth. We just learn from each other, right? So I'm happy you're here. I appreciate your time as always. Thank you for letting me take up a little bit of your day, and we'll see you in the next video. Toodaloo.